turn to 2 Samuel chapter 6, where we will have our text for this morning. And today's a fifth Sunday. And so we get 4 of those this year. And so I wanted to do, like we've done the years in the past, kind of tie all those together and do a series that is spread out throughout the year. We have one today. The last one is actually the last Sunday in December. So you got to wait a couple months in between each part of our series on this. But over these Sundays this year, we will be discussing our purpose statement as a church. This is something that our strategic planning committee did a great job of helping us walk through to kind of come up with a new articulation of why does Wynwood Baptist Church exist? What purpose do we serve in building God's kingdom? Why does He have us where He has us, just geographically, spiritually, relationally? And what are we supposed to do with our impact and influence in our resources? What is our purpose in life as a church? What's our purpose in the world? And so we broke that down to there's 4 different things that as a church we must accomplish. That if we accomplish nothing else, it'll be all right because we have done these 4 things and we've done them well. Today, the aspect of our purpose that we're going to talk about is worship. That as a church, part of our purpose is to simply be a group of people and to be individuals who are filled with worship towards God. Now, we have defined worship as focusing on God. That as a church and as individuals, we will spend time paying attention to God and who He is. And that will stir up a reaction inside of us. Worship fuels our service to Him. Worship fuels our desire to honor Him in our daily living. It's an incredibly important activity. Now, it's also an activity that it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. How many of y'all have heard the line somewhere in life, at home or at work, I don't care how you get it done, just get it done? Right? We've all heard that. Many of us have said that. To an employee, to a child, I don't care how you get your room clean, just get it clean. I don't care how you get that project done at work, just get it done. And worship, I would lump into an activity that fits that line real well. Because I don't think God cares how we worship Him. He just cares that we do. And one unique thing about worship is that we all tend to accomplish it in different ways. Jackie just did a great job of leading the worship portion of our service. And one way we do that on a weekly basis is through song. And many people, if you were to take a poll of 10 people this morning and say, how many of you feel like you connect with God through song? How many of you worship through song? Many of them would say yes. I'm someone that doesn't necessarily connect well with God through song. I do sometimes, but my times of worship are often when I'm doing something. Maybe I'm taking a walk or on a hike, or it's the end of the day and I'm thinking through what all of I've experienced, or what I've done at work, or something a conversation I had at home, and it draws my attention to how good God is, or how good God has been to me. And see, one key as we talk through this morning, and we're not going to break down how we should worship or ways we can, that's for us to figure out as individuals, but an overall key we all need to know is what are ways that we, as a person, connect with God? What are ways that we as an individual, that our attention is just drawn to Him, and those moments we spend focusing on Him fuel the rest of our spiritual life? And today, again, we break down from a story in the life and the ministry of King David. We look at a worship experience he had, and it gives us some cues that are applicable to our life, as well as to how we can make sure that whatever way we're going to do it, we do it and we experience a time of worship or time of focusing on God. The first thing we see David do within this passage is he reflected on God's work. And one way that we will all have our attention drawn to who God is and why He deserves to be worshipped is when we begin to focus on His activity in His life, or begin to focus on His work. I'm going to back up. I'm going to read verses 12 through 13, again out of the passage, out of chapter 6, and it reads, and it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who had bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. This whole passage begins and the rest of the lessons that we'll talk about today all hinge on the fact that David was reflecting on God's activity in David's leadership as king. That in David's time of serving as the king over Israel, David is thinking through that and all he has experienced and the work that God has accomplished through him. And as he does that, it causes him to engage in worship. It draws his attention towards God's character and his activity in his life. Now, this is a highly significant moment in David's time as king, because 2 things are going to happen at this moment in history. One, Jerusalem is being established as the new capital. So that's a political thing, a big political thing, but no doubt highly significant that the children of Israel and their geographic space that God had laid out, they're getting a new capital city. It's a big shift, but it's an important moment in David's kingship. But also with that, the Ark of the Covenant is being returned back to the children of Israel. It's being brought back to where it belongs. Now, the Ark of the Covenant is highly, highly, highly significant to the Israelites. And we don't want to miss that, because if we don't catch how important the Ark of the Covenant is, we don't understand why this is such a big deal to David. Now, the Ark of the Covenant was a box. Now, God was very precise in how the box was to be built. It carried within it significant reminders of Israel's history, and God was very particular in how it was to be handled and honored and respected. But at the end of the day, it was a box. And today, we can draw emotional attachments or sentimental attachments to physical things. Maybe the church you were baptized in, or the sanctuary you were married in, or that your children had some spiritual experience. There's an attachment there. And that's not all bad. But it's much more than that to the children of Israel. So there's not a parallel between the feelings we have towards a sentimental location and the Ark of the Covenant, because the Ark of the Covenant to them symbolized God's presence in their life. And when God was pleased with them, the Ark of the Covenant stayed in Israel and things went well for them. Now, they went well because during those times they were living in the relationship that God desired for them to have. Their hearts were in tune with His. Their lives were pointed in His directions. That's why things went well. But the Ark of the Covenant was a reminder of God's presence and the relationship He wanted to have with them. And from time to time in Israel's history, during some war or political skirmish or campaign, the Ark of the Covenant would get taken by an enemy nation. And it was a very, very dark time in the life of the Israelites. Now we're in a time to where it had been absent from them, but it's coming back. And it's that return of the Ark of the Covenant that David is celebrating, because it's a significant movement of God on their behalf. It's a huge moment, and it's something we've got to catch the gravity of that moment. And amongst all that, David is reflecting on God's work in his life. And the return of the Ark of the Covenant is a kind of a capstone of his career as king to this point. Now, David had already had a pretty impressive resume as king thus far. He had won major military battles. He had been anointed king. He had done a number of things that were already impressive. But this was a highly, highly significant moment. It's also true that up to this point in his life, he had some very, very dark times. He had had to flee the King Saul, in fear for his life. He didn't always function the way he should. But amongst all that, David could look over and see God's hand at work in his life. Amongst everything he had experienced so far as king, he could look back and see where God was at work. And in this kind of key moment, it all funnels together, and David is looking over his shoulder and tracing God's activity in his life. And when we take the time to look at how God is working, it draws our attention to him. And it fuels a heart of what we would call worship. And that heart may be expressed during song. That heart may be expressed sitting on our couch late at night or early of a morning. But when we look back over our recent life and our life as a whole, many of us can look back and see how God has worked in our behalf. And the things he has done for us, the way he has cared for us or provided for us, or situations that we saw no hope, but God produced a solution to. When we trace the hand of God at work, it will lead us to express a heart of worship. And David, he gets such this visual reminder of God's activity in his life as they bring the Ark of the Covenant back to Israel. And we may not feel like we've got that crowning moment, or it may not seem as dramatic, and it very well may not be, and that's all right. But we still have to make sure our minds and our hearts take the time to point out the ways God is working in our life, or in our family life of our church. All these different areas that our lives are intermingled with, and we look at that, and we identify this is how God's working, and that will help fuel or help maintain a heart of worship. The second thing David teaches us, this passage that we've got to remember, is that we need to express our appreciation. We need to express the thankfulness and the gratitude that we have towards God for that activity in our lives. And sometimes we just need to do that vocally. There's a number of ways we'll do that, but we've got to make sure we make the effort to let God know how grateful we are to him for his activity in our life. We're going to read verses 14 through 15. And it says, "And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn." David took the effort to express his gratitude or his appreciation to God. And he did it in some ways that we're not likely to do. It looked different for him based on what God was doing in that time he lived in. When we read those few verses, it says he danced in a linen ephod. Now, many of us probably don't dance. Now, there's a historical a Baptist tradition against dancing because the thought was that it would lead to more immoral activity. Now, I don't dance because of that. I don't dance because I'm not capable of dancing. Right? Recently, I heard a Baptist pastor asked, "Can Baptists dance?" And their thought, the gentleman asking the question was thinking back to the days to where pastors would condemn the prom. And to which this pastor said, "I've never met a Baptist that could dance." Right? Most of us, it's just not part of, and if it's part of your life, that's great. Not a problem. Most of us don't. Many of us here, we probably don't dance. Right? David did, which struck some people around him funny, because this did not paint the picture of a dignified king. David also danced in a linen ephod. I don't wear linen. I don't think it's a very manly cloth. It's what David wore that day. Ephod is a covering that very little clothing. Would have been often more of an undergarment that you would wear, have a robe or some sort of more kingly type dress over. But we are seeing David do this in a very public setting. He's dancing through the streets in a way that, again, as we'll read, it struck a lot of people as funny. They didn't understand why the king would behave that way. They didn't appreciate that. And we'll talk about that response in just a little bit. But what I want us to catch at this point was David made the effort to show God how thankful he was. David made the effort to show God how grateful he was. And he did it in a way that he was comfortable with. He did it in a way that worked for him. Didn't do it in a way that most of us are going to do today. And that's all right, because it worked for David. But the big lesson, one of the biggest lessons from today, is that when David traced the hand of God at work, that gratitude wasn't internalized. It was expressed. And sometimes as believers, we can be very good at thinking the right things about God, feeling the right things towards God, but not expressing the right things towards God. We may have thoughts of worship, but they go, but we don't let God know that. And yes, it's true, God knows our heart, but he also wants to hear our heart. And he wants us to put our heart of worship on display to him so that he doesn't just have to know about it. He also experiences us, express our gratitude for his work in our lives. There's a couple key ways we can do this throughout our daily living. One is verbal affirmation. Verbal affirmation. We need to tell God with words what he means to us. We need to tell God with words how thankful we are to him for all that he's done in our lives. We need to tell God with words about his character. And hear us say things like, God, you are good. You are loving. You have provided for me. And just talk to God about how good he is. He needs to hear that from us. He's got to hear it from us. It doesn't work for us just to think and not say the things that God deserves to hear. A heart of worship ought to be bubbling over with verbal affirmation of who God is and verbal thanks. And we don't simply internalize all those things that we think and believe about God. He hears them from us. It's important. He deserves to hear it. So we've got to carve out the time. Now, we can accomplish that on Sunday morning as a group under the leadership of Jackie or Josh and our choir or praise teams. That is a time that we verbally express to God how good he is and talk to him about our gratitude and his character. But we've got to do that on our own as well. Because Sunday mornings can't be the only time that God hears how we really think and feel about him. He needs to hear from us throughout the week on those things, in times of prayer. And again, in times of just quiet reflection on life and God's activity in our lives, God has to hear from us on a personal basis and in a group setting how good he is. And for us just to talk to him about his character and his activity and how grateful we are for both. The second way that we can express our gratitude or appreciation is through acts of service. And yes, acts of service to the people around him, but also serving God with our lives. That we would, as I often say when I talk to people about salvation, that we would truly commit the rest of our lives to serving him and to following his direction in our life. Because when we stop, or at least when I stop, and really think about who God is to me and everything he's done on my behalf and all the ways he has accomplished things I could have never done alone, starting with my salvation and the fact that I've got a personal connection with him, on to the ways that he's just taken care of me and presented me with opportunities and accomplished things in the ministries and the churches I've been a part of and led. When I think about all of those things, it motivates me to serve him and to follow his direction. Look, if we were to take all the activity that God has done for us in a spiritual sense, and if there was any way a human being could do that in an earthly sense, we would feel this huge indebtedness to them. That if someone else accomplished a portion of what God has done on our behalf, that person for the rest of our lives could ask anything of us and would go and do it. We need to have that same heart in our service to God. We need to look at it and say, God, based on who you are and the work you've done in my life, there isn't anything you can't ask me to do that I won't, or any way that I won't be more than willing to follow in you. Our life needs to be a service to him that begins in our time of worship, or that is fueled by our time of worship. The third way that we can express our gratitude towards God is a grateful lifestyle. Simply by living a life that honors him. Living a life that shows ourselves, those we live around, and the people around us that we are thankful for what God has done on our behalf. That we would talk about our lives in terms of, well, we serve God, and that is a positive for us, and we are thrilled that we have the opportunity to follow God's leadership in our life. And that all happens because we've taken the time to reflect on who he is, that we have a lifestyle that shows we're thankful for God's activity in our lives based on the way we live. That gratitude isn't just words, but it's actions as well, and our worship towards him trickles down to impact every corner of our life and every little activity we do. We express our gratitude by God by proving that with the way we live. Third truth we learn from our passage this morning is that we need to remain comfortable in how we worship God. We need to be very comfortable in our approach to worship. This is a lesson that David shows us, that he was comfortable and how he was going to express his gratitude towards God. The verses 16 through 20 read, "As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart." Excuse me. "And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts, and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his house. And David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, 'How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself.'" Like I said a bit ago, David has this response of worship. He's seen God. He has seen God at work. He's remembering all the ways God has worked in his life. They are at this huge moment for the whole nation of Israel, where they're doing things politically, but spiritually speaking, the Ark of the Covenant is returning home, and David can't contain his emotions in a good way. David couldn't put a lid on what his heart felt towards God and say, "Okay, I'll express this later, but I've got to be, so proper right now." David couldn't do it. David had no desire to do it. David was going to express his heart of worship in a way he was comfortable with, and didn't really have a concern for how other people around him would view that. Wasn't on David's radar to think about. But not everybody was comfortable with how David presented his heart of worship. His wife, Michal, which was Saul's daughter, David actually won the right to marry her by taking on a task for King Saul, a military task. Therefore, he got Saul's daughter in marriage. And his daughter was one of the people who was very vocally critical of how David expressed his heart of worship. And David expressed, this is my heart of worship. I'm not concerned with how you view it or how you interpret it. Not out of meanness, not out of arrogance, and I don't believe he was snide about it. But she approaches him and really comes down pretty hard, saying, you've embarrassed yourself. You've acted like those with no morals act. You've embarrassed me. How could you behave like that? You're the king. To which David's, I believe, the heart of his response was, but I've experienced this. That I've seen God do this, and there's no way I can contain that. There's no way that I can just keep a lid on the excitement and the gratitude that my heart feels. David was very comfortable in connecting with God in the way that he did. And that's something we need to be very comfortable with as well. Not just for ourselves, but we need to be comfortable in allowing other people to connect with God in a way they're comfortable with, whether that's our preferred method or not. Whether we like the way they connect with God or not. We've got to be very, and I'm using the word a lot, I don't know another way to say, we've just got to be comfortable in the way that we connect with God on a personal basis. There's a number of criticisms that worship gets. And this is a black eye sometimes on churches in general when we begin to critique the way other people worship. This comes out in song choice. That we don't like the songs that someone else sings. Well, that doesn't matter. We can say, I don't want to sing them, but sometimes that goes as far as saying, well, those songs can't be honoring to God. Well, we need to be comfortable singing the songs we like to sing. And if there's a song that helps us connect or reflect on God, we need to sing that. But if there's a song that helps someone else connect with and focus on God, we need to be thrilled that they're singing that. And we don't get caught up in what's more spiritual than the other, or how can that honor God? We just recognize that this is how I connect with God. And that works for me. If it doesn't work for someone else, they need to connect with God in a way that does work for them. And this is something that probably all of us experience at some point. My kids like a rap artist, a Christian rap artist. I don't. But I've bought their songs. Why? Because someone I care about connects with God through that. It teaches them truths about God through that. We need to embrace things like that across the board as churches and believers. One way we need to be comfortable is by completely living a lifestyle that is completely committed to serving God on a daily basis. We need to be comfortable doing that. Not everyone understands that. Not every believer understands when a brother or sister in Christ really fully commits their life to Him and is willing to do things that don't make sense to us, whether it's mission work or the time and the effort they sacrifice to the church. We've got to be comfortable in our level of commitment to God and His activity in our daily life. Third way that we remain comfortable, or third aspect of remaining comfortable in our approach is just to make sure we have the pure motives. Just to make sure that no matter how we're connecting with God, that we're doing it out of a desire to worship Him. And if we do that through song, great. We just know our heart's in the right place. If you're like me and you stand through a worship time with your hands in your pockets, but you connect with Him later on the day or later on the week, that's great. As long as our heart's really tuned in to focusing on Him and reflecting on how good and great He is in our lives. But we just keep a pure heart. And when our heart's pure and our motives are pure, our worship will be honoring to God. Look, David expressed his heart of worship in a very obscure way, a way that didn't make sense to a lot of people. But it made sense to him. And it made sense to God. And he was perfectly content to experience God in that way, express his heart of worship in that way, and was not fazed when other people didn't understand that. Our hearts need to be ready to do the same thing, that we reflect on God's work, we express that gratitude to Him, and we do it in a way that works for us. But again, it comes back to, it doesn't matter how you do it, you just got to make sure you do it. Today we learn some principles about worship. We look at David's life and how he experienced this time. But our big takeaway has to be, okay, these are the things I've been reminded of. How does this work for me? How do I put these truths or David's example into practice in my own life this coming week, later on today? How do these lessons from our time together this morning matter to us long term? In just a moment, Miss Jackie will come up. She will begin to help us close down our service. Before we come to a complete close, though, and before you even would join in song with Miss Jackie today, I'd ask for you just to stop and think of one reason that you're thankful for God's work in your life. Just look at one situation or one way He's moved in your life this past week, and just thank God for that, and let that be kind of a kickstart to a heart of worship for you this coming week. But let me pray for us as they come up. God, we thank you so much for this morning and for the time we've gotten to spend in your word, the ways that you've taught us or reminded us of something. God, I ask that you would be with us over the next few minutes, that as we think about your work in our lives, that would be a starting point for us maintaining a heart of worship. God, I pray that as we think on these things later on this week, we would be reminded of just how important it is to express our gratitude towards you. Thank you so much for our time together this morning, and continue to be with us as we go about the rest of our service and the rest of our day. It's in your name we pray. Amen. Would y'all please stand?